Good day and most welcome to 1684 of the Heidegger series. And today I will continue with Joachim Schulte's experience and expression. Wittgenstein's philosophy of psychology. Last time we went in even further into memory. Shall we say it's one of the most difficult subjects. The prevalent idea that memories are a sort of engravings is incredibly persistent. Almost unstoppable. And it's tempting to falling into the trap. That some sort of recording is going on of the outside reality. That forms into movement on a long string. A bead of occasions, if you like. Going endlessly back into the past and also endlessly into the future. The last bit we were discussing was the lightning speed of memory. I think it was a phrase that originated from William James, but it is an amazing thing. It all come in a sudden. There is no time lapse. It's just there all of a sudden, and what often comes to my mind is the concertos Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. They came to him in a flash. And the mistake here is to think that that instant all ingredients for the concerto was that there is a certain cause and effect present. This is denied by Wittgenstein. You can compare this to a previously mentioned anaphor or metaphor. The one that hands and gestures and expressions are following the music to show someone how to play. And the gestures of the person, the whole melody is not contained. It's not a seed. The other person needs to know the melody, the song, the piece, to be able to understand. Yes, it's accompanying. Yes, it is before. But it's not causative. It's necessary, but not causative. And these, one of those, so to speak, illusions or pictures, an image that we need to rid ourselves from. At the bottom, it's not words that causes the problem, but a picture of things. Pictures, images have a very mysterious, powerful influence on us. And at the bottom there is a picture. The picture is the bottom. And it cannot be approached directly. It needs to be, so to speak, circumscribed. Handled carefully, if you like. If too harshly criticized, its influence will just increase, like the Medusa. If you cut one head off, more heads will grow. maybe caringness would be the best attitude towards the picture. A soft caring for both the picture and oneself, that doesn't strongly criticize or attack. I'd say most of Wittgenstein's writings do not lend themselves to the prevalent attack mode of thinking. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. No, in Wittgenstein it's called for a softness. Softness and acceptance that opens up for understanding, broadening, deepening. The dissolvement of the problems is a process. Not similar at all to the Socratian meiotic. But there is a true answer already flying about. No, we approached the picture. We slowly read, think, feel, test. No strong arguments that forces us to accept. Instead a softness and a caringness. I often feel concern from Wittgenstein's side, helpfulness, good-heartedness. I will continue where I left off in 1681, and that was at page 111, and we are into the lightning speed of memory. This is 12, 13, 14, 9, something like that, down on the page. In the same way, there is nothing mysterious in remembering a certain event, a tune, a poem, in a flash. All it means is that one feels able to describe that event, to whistle the tune, or to repeat the poem without lengthy considerations or efforts of imagination. And there is a further similarity between the cases of understanding and remembering something in a flash. One may get it wrong. Perhaps I believe I understand something, and then it turns out that I have not grasped it correctly. I may believe I remember something, but then the supposed memory proves not to correspond to reality. The immediacy of remembering shows itself in the fact that a memory description need not be read off from anything. As we have seen, memory images or other kinds of representation do sometimes agree with our memory statements, but such images tend to be accompanying phenomena or memory aids. And such an aid may consist in deliberately imagining something different from that which one is trying to remember. This immediacy applies to memories of external events, just as much as to memories of thoughts and psychological states. I can describe yesterday's walk straight away without having to reflect or to call anything to mind. And I can give an account of an idea I had last year, or of the melancholy I felt in the spring, without retracing the steps which led to that idea, or imagining myself in a melancholy mood. The characteristic of the impossibility of reference failure indicates a certain similarity between remembering on the one hand and intending or meaning on the other. Of course, this does not mean that in remembering we cannot make mistakes. What it means is that as far as the reference of a person's memories is concerned, that person himself is the last court of appeal. Let us, for purposes of illustration, think of the following example. Let us, someone says, when I mentioned a consummate ass, I meant X. If I point out to the speaker that X, that is the man who is really called X, cannot, for one reason or another, be the person intended. He may reply, "You are quite right. I did not mean X. I meant Y." Or you may be right. The man I mean is someone who has done such and such. There are many respects in which I can correct the speaker's utterances. For instance, if he has confused different names. Or if his description is incoherent, etc. But whether or not he meant this or that person is a question which only he himself can decide, even if we shall never find out who the intended person is. In a similar state, we may be able to recognize the speaker's memory statement as a mistake, as mistaken, and to correct it. But who and what the memory is about is again a question which only he himself can decide. Of course, both in the cases of intending and meaning as well as in that of remembering, there exists the possibility of a radical failure, but a definite conclusion to that effect can only be drawn by the speaker himself. And in such a case, he may say, I believed I remembered X, but now I see that I got it wrong. There is no such person as X, or I have never met X, etc. this form of expression, I believed, I remembered such and such, by means of which the speaker admits his mistake. Just as he shows his uncertainty by using a phrase like I believe, I remember that, serves to bring out the subjective element of remembering. But the word subjective hardly amounts to more than saying that the speaker himself is the last court of appeal, which decides whether he is uncertain or in error. These three characteristics happening in a flash, immediacy, and impossibility of reference failure place remembering in the vicinity of intending and meaning, of which similar things can be said. Thus, remembering is completely different from sensations or feelings. For genuine duration, which is essential to the latter, is not a necessary condition of remembering, and there is also no characteristic expression of remembering. Just as there is no characteristic expression of intending or meaning. In at least one respect, however, there is a general difference between remembering on the one hand and intending or meaning on the other. Whereas in the case of memory, I can speak of voluntary or involuntary acts of remembering. This distinction applies neither to intending nor to meaning. There's no doubt that memory, the faculty to remember things, is at the basis of all knowledge and of numerous intellectual as well as practical skills. We have no idea of how talking or playing the piano, science of ballroom dancing, might be possible if we lacked the faculty of memory. It is obvious that memory is extremely important. And this is why we feel that we should get to the bottom of this phenomenon. And there is a widely held conception which suggests itself as useful in the attempt to understand this phenomenon. Namely, the conception of memory as a kind of store. Where certain impressions leave traces which will remain recognizable or become faint, and which we may call up, scrutinize, forget. This basic idea has been accepted by many philosophers who have in some cases contributed further images to supplement this conception. A particularly vivid account is given by Plato in his Theaetetus, where Socrates asks his interlocutor to imagine quote, that our minds contain a block of wax which in this or that individual may be larger or smaller, and composed of wax that is comparatively pure or muddy. And harder in some, softer in others, and sometimes of just the right consistency. Let us call it the gift of the muse's mother memory, and say that whenever we wish to remember something we see or hear or conceive in our own minds, we hold this wax under the perceptions or ideas and imprint them on it as we might stamp the impression of a seal ring. Whatever is so imprinted, we remember and know so long as the image remains. Whatever is rubbed out or has not succeeded in leaving an impression, we have forgotten and do not know. Theaetetus, it does ring a bell of modern way of thinking of memory without a doubt. It's uncanny. It's uncanny similar. And in a similar way, Locke, in a well-known passage in his essay, speaks of memory as a storehouse in which our ideas are laid up. I think I continue with Locke next. After the pause. Thank you very much. So we continue, and we just left off with Locke here in a similar way, and I'll just repeat it. It's great. Locke, in a well-known passage of his essay, speaks of memory as a storehouse in which our ideas are laid up. This device is regarded as necessary by Locke because man's mind is too restricted to keep a large number of ideas under review simultaneously. So a storage depot is needed where ideas are kept and from which they may be taken out whenever the situation requires it. In this storehouse, however, our ideas excuse me. Oh. Sorry. Our ideas quickly fade and often vanish quite out of the understanding, leaving no more footsteps or remaining characters of themselves than shadows do flying over fields of corn. And the mind is as void of them as if they never had been there. So here again we encounter the basic conception of a store where impressions are kept, provided they have imprinted themselves on the mind. And as long as these traces do not fade away completely, but it's not only philosophers, let alone only philosophers of the past who appeal to this notion of memory as a storehouse of such traces. There are psychologists of a scientific orientation who regard this conception as basic and formulate their theories accordingly. Wolfgang Köhler, for example, writes that all sound theories of memory must contain hypotheses about memory traces as physiological facts. And they must also assume that the characteristics of traces are more or less akin to those of the processes by which they have been established. For otherwise, how could the accuracy of recall be explained, which in a great many cases is quite high? Whereas most philosophers vaguely locate the storehouse of memory in the mind, Köhler assigns it a physiological place. In this way, his hypothesis of a kinship or correspondence between triggering impression and stored trace gains a kind of definiteness which the more metaphysical accounts given by Plato and Locke are lacking. This more definite conception of memory in terms of stored traces which can be described and perhaps even explained in a physiological way is criticized by Wittgenstein in two respects. An event leaves a trace in the memory. One sometimes imagines this as if it consisted in an event's having left a trace, an impression, a consequence in the nervous system. As if one could say, Even the nerves have a memory. But then when someone remembered an event, he would have to infer it from the impression. This trace whatever the event does leave behind in the organism, it isn't the memory. The organism compared with a dictaphone spool. The impression, the trace, is the alteration in the spool that the voice leaves behind. Can one say that the dictaphone or the spool is remembering what was spoken all over again when it reproduces what it took? Before we go into some of the details of this criticism, a preliminary remark will be in order. Here Wittgenstein criticizes neither the idea that some events leave in our nervous system certain traces which are somehow connected with our memories. Nor the comparison between an organism and a dictaphone spool. He turns against these ideas only insofar as they become incompatible with our actual notion of memory. That is, insofar as they postulate states of affairs or forms of expression whose assumption is implausible or incoherent. What this conception of memory as a trace in the nervous system implicitly asserts is the existence of a mediating link between impression and memory. And here the alleged mediating link is not only supposed to be a real and possibly inevitable physiological substrate of memories. It is supposed to be the essence of memory. This would mean that we have to read off or infer our uttered or thought memory statements from those traces in our nervous system. Roughly speaking, the kind of model here envisaged involves the following idea. impressions and thoughts are in some form coded and stored. They are recorded. By rereading these records, I become aware of the original impressions or thoughts, that is. I infer them from the representations in my nervous system. Now, part of this account may, for reasons of convenience, simply be accepted, even though it is surely justifiable to wonder whether the assumption of the existence of certain parts of this model is more plausible than the assumption of their non-existence. Wittgenstein merely says that the traces in the organism are records or representations may be all kinds of things, but are certainly not memories. The concept memory must not be applied to them. To be sure, this is by itself not an argument against the model we have characterized, but it seems to me that it is possible to infer a number of reasons for Wittgenstein's criticism from the passage quoted and from some further remarks. all these reasons amount to saying that we need more than mere traces in a memory store if we are to decide whether or not something is to count as a memory. Let us first think of the case of a false memory statement. I believe I remember having been in Marienbad last year, but I am wrong. I have been in Karlsbad. Where does my mistake reside? Did I make an error in recording the fact? Has the storing caused a certain defect? Or did I make a mistake in reading the record? We shall never find out. And to this extent, the envisaged model is nothing but superfluous ballast. But let's us suppose further that I correct this mistake without external assistance. For instance, by thinking of the root by which I reach the destination of my trip, and calling various images to mind. In which way will our model allow such correction? It is on this model conceivable that through various considerations we hit on incompatible records, and it may also be acceptable that there is an inner decision procedure which leads to cancelling the less plausible record. But what appears hardly intelligible according to the model is the common phenomenon of the right thing popping into one's mind after the false memory has been discarded. For where should the true record come from if it has not been there from the very beginning? And if it has been there from the very beginning, the supposed existence of the mistaken record becomes impossible to explain. The only way out of this difficulty would be the assumption that all memory mistakes are a kind of reading error. But that would in its turn be incompatible with the equally common phenomena that we let documents and considerations persuade us of the falsity of a certain memory claim. While experiencing not the slightest change in the subjectively certain memory record, which has turned out to be false. Had my mistake been a reading error, I should have been able to read this memory record correctly without getting any assistance from outside. A second reason for rejecting the envisaged model is that it does not indicate any way of explaining the reference of our memories. Of course, it may be that quite a few of the alleged traces in the memory store are somehow associated with definite descriptions which can, in the process of looking in that store, somehow be decoded and thus permit clear reference to what is remembered. But the overwhelming majority of our memories cannot possibly be based on definite descriptions. It is quite obvious that even for myself, many of my memories acquire shape and definiteness only through pointing to objects, people, pictures, etc., or through reproducing or repeating sounds and smell. I may claim that I remember Mr. X without being able to mention any features which is characteristic of him. But as soon as I see Mr. X or a picture of Mr. X, I say that is Mr. X. And this shows that I really remember him. If, however, I do not recognize him, I shall have to admit that I do not remember him. But where does the difference lie? According to our envisage model, whether or not my memory statement has a reference cannot, on this model, depend on whether or not I am able to point to Mr. X. For according to it, memories are read off or inferred from traces in my nervous system, and potentially detectable. That is, the mind is regarded as somehow able to distinguish various contents according to their origins. To illustrate this by means of a simplified example, sense impressions arrive at track 1, feelings on track 2, memories on track 3, etc. The mind recognizes that it is dealing with memories from the fact that it must first read their traces, whereas impressions, images, and other contents of consciousness do not require that. This conception, however, involves two difficulties which deprive it of its possible plausibility. I'll have to end the reading here. 1684. It reminds me of Ian McGilchrist's depiction of schizophrenics. They see themselves as made up of machine-like parts, and their bodies are made of material stuff that doesn't contain movement. Whereas a healthy human being, the body is lighter than air. And that movement is the thinking spirit. This model, especially as explained by metaphors of wax or a storehouse, as in the idea of lock, are similar. They are fixed. They do not seem to fit the picture like a big block of stone in a nice garden without any aesthetic features or something that brings it to life. And the reading idea is so powerful. I'd say it sort of dominates all of our thinking. Inability to remember something is almost like I had it on the tip of my tongue. I lost the memory. The idea is once I regain the memory, it will be clear and true. There are a lot of, I would say, not big problems. And as usual with Wittgenstein, these problems are not that big, but they add up. And I think they help you to regain your natural intuition about language, the world. That's why I appreciate him not putting argument down so strongly. But there is a discussion going on. And a lot of his thinking is almost artistic, his images. We are stuck with an image, and only a more healthy image can bring us out of that image. The computer model was absolutely dominant in neurology and science of cognition, psychology still to this day, that you do a sort of memory retrieval. Do you get hit on your head? You lose for a while the ability to retrieve memory. That's the idea. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, or wherever you are.